So let us look at diffusion. In diffusion, we already know that it is a passive process, and the meaning of that is that you don't actually need ATP, or you don't need energy, because energy is in the form of ATP, and ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So that means that with diffusion, you are having material or particles moving along the concentration gradient. Okay, and we see this in alveoli and also other parts, as we shall see later on. But definitely, we start with this scenario. So you have a farmer who has observed that fish in a warm pond become active but die quickly when the water becomes stagnant. So let's discuss what might be happening at cellular level. Okay, so the questions are, explain how diffusion is involved in gaseous exchange in fish gills. And then the second question is, explain how the decrease in dissolved oxygen in stagnant water affects the diffusion and survival of the fish. So basically what this scenario is all about is about the fact that the fish actually obtain the oxygen that they need from the water. So that oxygen has to be dissolved in water, and for that oxygen to basically get dissolved in this water sufficiently, the water should be moving. Okay, it should be moving for that, for oxygen to be dissolved and for the fish to be able to get this oxygen. But if the water is actually stagnant, then you are not going to have oxygen getting dissolved. And that's why this is what you basically see with the fish basically being in distress and actually dying. And the whole point is that oxygen should get dissolved in water, and when it is dissolved in water, and when water passes over the gills, the oxygen diffuses into the gills, and then it is basically carried into the fish, and the fish can be able to metabolize nutrients in the presence of oxygen. So definitely the fish need oxygen for aerobic respiration. Okay, so that's basically what happens when you don't have sufficient dissolved oxygen. The fish will suffocate and die. Okay, so the concept of diffusion is that you're having particles moving from where they are in high concentration to where they are in low concentration. So we are referring to the particles themselves, or molecules themselves. They are moving from where they are more to where they are less. And this can happen across the cell membrane. So that means that when, for example, you have more ions or molecules in one side, they will move to the other side where they are less. And that is what happens across the cell membrane. And that is diffusion. So it happens along the concentration gradient, where you have particles moving until you have an equilibrium where the particles on either side are actually of the same number. Okay, so that means that you're not having a concentration difference, or you don't have a concentration gradient. So this diffusion can be simple diffusion when you don't have any other helping molecule to transport these particles. And this happens if you have this movement across a cell membrane, which is basically made up of phospholipid bilayer. So you don't need any energy. But with the facilitated diffusion, you need a helper, and that helper comes in the form of what we term as transport proteins, or we can term them as protein carriers. So this process is a passive process. No energy is actually required. It is actually much faster than simple diffusion. Okay, so diffusion helps in movement of many things. movement of nutrients, movement of waste products, movement of gases. And therefore, we are basically saying that diffusion is important in enabling organisms to get oxygen. For example, we saw in the gills, the same thing that happens also in mammals. So the oxygen diffuses into the red blood cells, okay, and it is carried to the different tissues. The same thing happens to carbon dioxide, and then the same thing basically happens in plants, where carbon dioxide diffuses in and also oxygen diffuses out. And then also absorption of nutrients in the intestines into the bloodstream, and the same thing happens for absorption of nutrients and mineral salts from the root hair or in the root hair. And then organisms like the amoeba, which is basically unicellular, depend on diffusion for its and transport needs. Okay, so diffusion is very fast if you have a large concentration gradient. That means that you have more particles one side and less of those same particles on the other side. That is a steep concentration gradient or a great concentration gradient. And then if the distance to be moved is actually very short, and then increasing temperature increases the kinetic energy of the particles or molecules, and therefore increases the kinetic energy. If you have smaller particles, they will diffuse faster than the heavier particles. And then presence of a permeable membrane means that it will allow more of these particles to move. And then large surface area means that you have sufficient surface area for movement of these particles, and therefore you have a high diffusion rate. High density of the medium, that means that the particles can actually move slowly if there is high density. So that means that if you want to have high rate of diffusion, you need to have a low density of the medium. Okay? Clear? So we move to facilitated diffusion. In this case, we basically know that you need a carrier protein. You need a molecule that will be able to carry these molecules or compounds from one part of this, from one side of the cell membrane to the other side of the cell membrane. And we already said it is a passive process, and it is faster than simple diffusion. So we look at this scenario. You have a diabetic patient who is being monitored for glucose uptake into the cells. Medical staff explain that even though glucose is small, it requires a specific carrier protein to enter the cells. Okay, and that therefore means that glucose is transported into cells through facilitated diffusion because of this carrier protein. We already said that you cannot have carrier proteins in simple diffusion, and therefore facilitated diffusion is actually much more faster than simple diffusion. Okay, so why is glucose using facilitated diffusion to enter cells while oxygen uses simple diffusion? That's the question that we have there. And then another question is describe one similarity and difference between facilitated diffusion and active transport, and then predict what could happen if the carrier protein for glucose actually malfunctions. Okay, I think we can start with that last question. When you don't have these carrier proteins, it means that some of these molecules will not be transported efficiently. So in this case, there will be a problem with the absorption of glucose into cells. And remember that glucose can still diffuse, okay, from the GIT or from the small intestines, especially into the bloodstreams. And then when the glucose is in the bloodstream, it has to be taken up by the cell such that you have a normal blood glucose levels. And therefore, if we cannot take this glucose into the cells, then it means that you're going to have high glucose levels in blood, and that is an issue to do with diabetes mellitus. Okay, so you have increased blood glucose in your blood. And then the similarity, one similarity and difference between facilitated diffusion and active transport. One similarity is, of course, they involve movement of molecules or even ions across the cell membrane. Okay, the difference is that one is an active process, that is, active transport uses energy, and then for facilitated diffusion, you don't have energy being utilized. And then the other point is about explaining why glucose uses facilitated diffusion to enter into the cells, while oxygen uses simple diffusion. It's basically because you have glucose transporters in cell membranes of certain cells. But oxygen, we don't have special transporters or special oxygen carrier molecules such that they can use facilitated diffusion. So oxygen basically just enters the cells through simple diffusion because of lack of those carrier proteins for oxygen. So we have already defined that. The key thing is that there should be carrier proteins, and this usually traverse the whole cell membrane. Okay, so they aid in movement of these organic compounds like glucose and even sometimes minerals. It is much faster than diffusion, and that's why you see that the blue curve is actually higher compared to the passive diffusion that you're having there. The key thing is that you can categorize these special carriers or special protein carriers into two: carrier proteins and then channel proteins. The key thing is that both of these are actually proteins. And if you can look at this image here, we are having carrier protein there. Okay, so the carrier protein usually can undergo a conformational change. So the molecule attaches on one side and then it is released on the other side. And then for channels, you're basically having parts for these either minerals or even organic compounds to take. Okay, so glucose needs carrier proteins, and we are saying that if glucose does not have carrier proteins, it will not go into the cells where we need to store it. Okay, so the glucose needs to be taken into the muscles, need to be taken into fat cells or adipocytes. It also needs to be absorbed from the intestines into the bloodstream, and the same thing also happens in the kidney tubules. Okay, so usually this is down the concentration gradient, and like we said, it is aided by conformational change. The protein carrier or the carrier protein basically changes its structure. That's what we term as the conformational change. Okay, when we have channels, when we talk about channel proteins, we are talking about holes through which these materials can basically pass. Okay, so these channels can be ligand gated. Okay, that means that for them they open when you have a particular molecule that binds to them, and then they can open. And then others can only open when there is an impulse where you have a change in membrane potential. And therefore, these channels basically are very important for ion movement, chloride, potassium, calcium, chloride, and hydrogen carbonate ions. In plants, for example, we have special carrier proteins that we call aquaporins. So the aquaporins are found in plants, but also some animal cells also have them. So they basically make the process of transport very fast. They increase the process of transport very fast. They increase the process of transport. Okay, so they increase the rate of osmosis down the water potential gradient. Okay, so across some plant and animal cells, you can have what we call the aquaporins that increase the rate of transport of these molecules. Okay, simple diffusion, you don't need a carrier protein. It's facilitated, you definitely need. Facilitated diffusion usually follows one direction, but for simple diffusion, because of the concentration gradient, you have movement happening, mainly the particles moving from where they are highly concentrated to where they are in low concentration. But of course, that does not mean that you cannot have some particles moving in the opposite direction. But of course, what we shall see is that they are moving to the area of low concentration. So facilitated diffusion is faster, and we have explained that. Okay, so both processes involve transport of materials. Okay, so they move from high to low, and that's what, therefore, you don't have energy being required, and happens across a semi-permeable membrane or a